Welcome, everyone. I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thank you for joining us for another 30-minute skills. As a reminder, all our 30-minute skills are available at nefac.org/30-minute skills. They include data cleaning, data visualization, privacy law, Microsoft Excel basics, how to diversify sources, and how to protect yourself as a journalist, among many other topics. You'll also find at nefac.org a growing list of upcoming presentations and events focused on the First Amendment and journalism. Nearly all of them are free and open to the public, so please check them out and consider joining us. Today, we'll be discussing the art of the pitch, how to best pitch your work to editors and publishers, and make sure your reporting gets the attention it deserves. We have a lot to cover and not a lot of time, so let's get started. Joining us today is NEFAC's own Maggie Mulvihill, an investigative reporter, attorney, and professor at Boston University. Maggie, thanks for being here. All yours.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. As Justin said, I teach at Boston University. I've taught there for 12 years. I teach data journalism, media law, and ethics. I also am a working journalist, and I not only do my own stories, but I do stories with my students and have to regularly pitch to editors. We mostly do print and online stories, but I have to regularly pitch their work and my own work. So what we're going to do today is give you 5 steps for success in pitching. And at the end of the presentation, I have some resources for you that maybe will be helpful, especially if you're a freelance journalist. So the most important thing, and what I always tell my students, is that you have to have a fairly well-formed story idea that has been pre-reported before you can even think about making a pitch. How we approach it in class is when we have a story idea, we do what we call a clip search or a scrub. We go back about 3 years to see whether that specific story has been covered in local media in our market, which is New England. And if it has, if that very specific angle of our story has been covered, we'll move on to another story idea. Because as I constantly have to tell my students, we have to break something new. We can't repeat what's already been out there. We have to break a new piece of the story, even if it's just a new twist on the story or new angle to the story. But it's got to be news. And we use things like Fractiva, Nexus Uni, ProQuest. My students generally Google things, and that is a big mistake because Google doesn't reach anything of what is actually out there. You have to do very, very targeted research, including social media and looking at local news outlets to absolutely make sure that your story has not been broken in some other outlet, because otherwise you're just wasting your time. And I also recommend that when we have a specific story idea, not only are we doing our scrub and maybe working with data or documents to do some analysis, but we talk to experts in the field about our story idea to make sure that we are asking the right questions. And we're actually becoming subject matter experts on whatever idea we're having. For example, I'll show you, we did a story about the criminalization of homeless people in Boston, and we talked to a lot of advocates who worked with the homeless, as well as criminologists, before we even were able to formulate our story idea and pitch it to the partners we were working with. So we really had a handle on the topic. The worst thing that you can do is send a pitch, pitching a story idea, and find out from the editor, well, we published that last week, or asking some specific questions about your story idea that you can't answer. And I also recommend setting up Google alerts to stay on top of any news, because that does quite a big sweep of the web. And, as long as your search terms are very specific, you should get pretty targeted hits, and it helps you to stay updated on whatever it is that you're covering. So I just have a couple examples here. This is a story I published with my students in the Maine Monitor. And we did a lot of pre-reporting on this story before we even pitched it. We requested, using public records requests, all of the disciplinary actions taken by the Maine State Harness Racing Commission to see how they were punishing errant trainers or owners or jockeys. And we analyzed the data before we even recommended to the editor that this was a viable story. So we did quite a bit of pre-reporting, and really were able to come up with a focus question that we were trying to answer. So it is an investment of time, but you do want to make that investment and become the person who's most knowledgeable about that topic. This is another story that I did with my students in the New Bedford Light, which is another nonprofit news outlet in Massachusetts. And I write a lot about this drug lab crisis in Massachusetts for a bunch of different outlets. So I know the topic very, very well, but my students had to get up to speed and talk to some of the lawyers that were involved. And when we went to make the pitch to the New Bedford Light, we actually could write the lead for the story and some of the supporting paragraphs because we had done so much pre-reporting on it. So I can't stress that enough. That is the absolute first rule of successful pitching. The second piece of advice I would give is draft an elevator pitch and a headline before you go to an editor, in as tightly crafted words as possible. Less is more. The last thing that an editor wants to get or will be interested in is a 5-paragraph email when they're so busy. Get right to the point. Exactly what is it that you are going to break that's new, and explain why this is timely, why the story has to be published now. Maybe if it's competitive, include that. Maybe that can prompt the editor to respond more quickly. If you have any multimedia or any supporting documentation that could augment the story, you could send that along, or include that in your pitch, either as an attachment or just as part of the paragraph or two that you write. And also suggest a headline, because that might capture the editor's attention quickly. It's hard to do and try to write your story idea in 6 or 8 words, but it helps you practice to write very, very tightly when you're making your pitch. So I would recommend no more than a couple paragraphs sending to an editor, because they're so busy. And this is the story that we did for the Boston Globe on the criminalization of the homeless. And we had gotten, before we even sent the idea over to the Globe, we had gotten data from the Boston police that showed 1 in 8 arrests in Boston over a certain period of time were homeless people. So these were my students that I worked with on this story. And so we already had a verified finding. It was newsworthy. The story had not been done, and we made that clear in our pitch that we had something brand new. And we had data which we sent along with our pitch to try to interest the editor, and so it was accepted, and then we sent them a draft and started the editing process. The third tip that I would mention is really, really research potential editors and publishers or producers. I just got an email recently from somebody who spelled my name wrong, and it was from another journalist wanting me to do actually a training. and that's an immediate turn off, especially for a journalist. You should be spelling people's names correctly. But I've also gotten emails from people, for example, asking me about an investigative reporting center that I co-founded, and I left in 2013. So they're sending me an email in 2023. So they clearly haven't kept up with my career and what I have done. And what I'm saying to you about editors or producers, if you're pitching to TV or radio, is that you want to spend some time really knowing which editors out there might be interested in your topic. And again, I give some resources at the end of this presentation, but you wouldn't want to send to a criminal justice editor at CNN an environmental story. And so you do have to do some research and try to identify the right person within the news outlet or magazine who might be interested in your topic. You can look at recent stories on the news outlet, and I've even made phone calls to see who handles specific topics. Here is an example of a situation where I got to the absolute right editor, and so my pitch was taken. This was a story I did for NBC Digital last year, again about the Massachusetts State Crime Lab. And my pitch was made to an editor who actually had a great interest in this story. It's a Massachusetts story, so it's unusual that a national editor might be interested in a story in Massachusetts, but this particular editor had not only was interested in this story, but had been considering doing some stories with her own reporters at NBC on it. And then I sent her an email, and I'll show you the pitch that I made. This is the pitch that I made, which was, really, really tight. In the subject line, I had a potential headline, and then one paragraph about the story that I was proposing to break. And I attached a court ruling so that the editor knew, had confidence that there was actually a decision by a judge that was going to widen the crisis. And then I sent her the top couple of graphs for the story. And so within probably a half hour of me sending this, I got a phone call from her, and they wanted the story, and I did the story with them that very day. And I got to this editor by asking friends in the news business if they knew of any criminal justice editors at news outlets around the country that I might, that might be interested in this story. And this was one of the names that came up. So it is worth the time to make the investment in trying to figure out who, and just ask people, do you know anybody who maybe would be interested in this environmental story or this feature story, or, they might not answer you, but they might be willing to help you. And so that would be my third piece of advice. Same here. This is another situation where I found an editor who was very, very interested in this particular topic of forensic labs. And this was another criminal justice editor. And I had to try a couple of times to get a response, but then I did. And now we're doing stories on the Massachusetts State Drug Lab crisis. So obviously you then have to send your pitch, and again, you want to craft it really, really carefully. You want to also think about when you're going to send it. We're all deluged by emails, and imagine busy editors get hundreds of emails a day. So what's going to stand out for them? What's worth clicking on and responding to, especially if you're unknown to them? You want to make it as powerful as possible, both in the subject line and in your pitch. And brief, I tell my students all the time, good writing is brief and bold, brief and bold. The less, the better, but make it powerful. And again, as I said before, if you have data or documents or some other element like photos or video or audio or a map or a graph, include that with your pitch so they have another way to look at the story idea and consider it. Because you have to remember they're getting pitched probably all day long by their own reporters as well as freelancers. And you want to make yours so distinctive and so compelling and so timely that you're the person they're going to respond to. So this is an example of a story that I did with the Boston Globe, where I had some information about a federal overtime scandal that that I sent over to an editor at the Globe, and we paired up with another reporter and did this story about looking a little more deeply about this ongoing overtime scandal involving the Boston police, which is still going on. And I had some data and some documents and some court records that we used. And this editor just happened to be very interested in what was happening with this set of cases. So it's a matter of getting to the right person. If it had been a different editor, I might not have been able to do the story, but it's a matter of getting to the right person and keeping, my approach is I have a story, it's newsworthy, it hasn't been done before. This is why it's timely and important. And if it's competitive, I always mention that. And here's another example of a story that I did where, again, we had some court records and I had done an interview with the Middlesex District Attorney about the state drug lab crisis in Massachusetts. So I had something new there, and I was able to present that to the editor and get paired up with another reporter. That's another piece of advice I would give. Be willing to share your information. It takes some risk, but hopefully you'll develop relationships with editors that you trust. This editor at the Globe, I completely trust, and I can share information with him. I do it regularly, and be open to getting paired up with maybe a staff reporter. Don't insist on doing the story yourself, because maybe if you're willing to be more collaborative with the news organization, they might be more willing to take your story. So, so that's another thing that I would mention to think about. And when you're pitching a story, maybe just include a line in your pitch. I'd be happy to work with one of your staff reporters on this, as I think the story is very important to get out there, and that might catch their attention as well. And then my last piece of advice is follow up, but follow up very strategically. So the first thing I would say is let go of your ego. If you don't get a response and you don't get another response and you don't get another response, who cares? Just be politely persistent about following up, and don't take it personally if somebody hasn't responded to you. If you believe in your story and it's a good story, and this person isn't interested, then move on to the next editor. And let your ego go, because people are so busy. They get we have so many inputs all day long, text messages, emails, phone calls, just Slack, just so much going on. And, people may not get back to you for a week or two or even longer, but that's okay. You just be politely persistent, and get on the phone. I mean, it is so easy to ignore emails. My students often want to contact people by email and not get on the phone or go face to face, go to the mayor's office, go to the state house. but work those phones very aggressively, leave messages, and follow up regularly to try to get somebody on the phone, because that always is so much more powerful than an email, which you can just delete, delete, delete. It's a little bit harder to get off the phone with somebody. I'd also remind the people you're pitching to, if your story is competitive, and it may not be, it may be a feature story that isn't competitive, but if it is competitive, if you are going to get beat, there's other reporters working that same angle. I would absolutely mention that to the editor, and that you're pitching. Let's see if there's a couple other pieces of advice here. And as you're reporting, if, say, for example, the news outlet has taken your pitch, I would stay in close communication with them as you're reporting, and if new developments arise, make sure that you pass that along to them, because they may make different decisions about how the story is going to be published, where, what part of where, for example, if it's a newspaper, what part of the newspaper it's going to be published in, and stay in really good communication with your editor. The worst thing a reporter can do is not communicate with an editor. So all the editors I work with, for my own stories as well as my students, I make sure to be in touch with them every couple of days or so, just to let them know of any new development, a new interview I did, just to make sure that communication is continuing. And then the last thing I would say is, if you can, if there is a small detail that doesn't have to be broken with your first story, if you can hold something back, some newsworthy detail, but that really doesn't have to be broken immediately. Another strategy is to hold that back and then report that the following day or the following week, to immediately have a strong follow-up, which amplifies your story. And so that's something that I have used in my career to try to ensure that I get a strong follow-up to my story. So here I have some resources for you. It's another story that I did. Another story that I did with my students. And again, before we get to the resources, I'll just mention this. This was a story we did about workplace safety during COVID. And the story came up as we were talking to various health boards across Massachusetts, and how they had to become experts on OSHA and workplace safety, which really wasn't their function at all. You can see this quote here: "It's brutal, it's brutal, it's off the charts," because they had to really overnight handle a whole different part of employment that they had never been trained on. And so with this pitch, we actually sent the paragraph to the editor about what the story that we were getting, and we included this quote to really punctuate how vivid the story was, that these Massachusetts Health Board workers were really, really concerned about what was going on. And editors always respond to a strong quote. And so they can see that you've already done some interviewing, you've gathered some really good information, and you have really strong quotes for the story. So that was one of the selling points of this story that we did, which ran in the AP, and we did with the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism. I do have some resources here. I know you're going to get these presentations, so these are all linked. A couple of them are Substack newsletters with a lot of freelance opportunities. This one, Opportunities of the Week, at the bottom, is actually very good. It is paid. It's a minimal, maybe $5 a week or something, but it's actually very good if you are willing to spend the money because it has a lot of new opportunities for pitches. And then journalismjobs.com, which is most often used for full-time employment, does have a section for freelancers. So I hope those are helpful.
Maggie, thank you for all of this. Great resources, a lot of excellent guidance. We do have 2 questions before we wrap up here. Going to the pitch itself, you gave that great example that people can use that included, I think, the first 4 graphs of the story that you're trying to pitch. For those that are working in radio, for example, would you recommend that they provide other media? So for example, if you're making a radio pitch, would you suggest that they provide a sample of the audio or other media other than the written story to include in their pitch when they reach out to editors?
I mean, I've done very few radio stories, but I mean, just as a general matter of practice, any compelling detail that you have, no matter what medium it's in, that could persuade an editor that you have a strong story, I would include it. I don't see how that could hurt. It would only help. I've never sent audio with a pitch, but I would think that would make a lot of sense.
Great. And then last question here, running low on time, want to get to this because this seems to be a concern from a number of people that have attended today. What about the idea that you're going to send this information to an editor, to a publisher, and you'll get scooped by giving them a story that maybe they weren't aware of? Is there any concern about those you reaching out to stealing your story idea and maybe not getting back to you, or not being willing to work with you, but taking your story and running with it on their own?
And the answer is yes. I have gotten stories taken from me. That's why, I mean, it's a risk that you have to take. But that is why I say to you, really deeply research the people that you're pitching to. Don't just blindly send stuff out to anybody, and really try to get on the phone with them. It is a risk that you're taking. We are supposed to behave ethically in this business, and it does get around if editors are stealing stories from reporters. My students have had story ideas stolen from them. But you want to be positioned pretty quickly to do the story for somebody else in case they do steal it. And I would make some noise about them. I would go over their head and complain to their boss. I would make some noise about it, maybe tweet about it, because it is unethical to do that. But it's really not something that you can control. You do have to take some risk. The editors I work with, I've known for a long time, and I trust. But I've been working with them for a long time. So getting into a relationship with an editor is really important.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think having strong relationships, doing your homework, preparing, all helps reduce the risk that story idea will be stolen. So thank you for that, Maggie. Very much appreciate all of your time, your guidance, and many thanks to everyone for joining us today. If you found today's class helpful in your work in any way, please consider becoming a sustaining member at NEFAC. NEFAC.org/join. Your annual support is what helps us provide classes like this one. So please go to NEFAC.org, consider joining or supporting in any way you can. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you all again.
Thanks, everybody.
We'll see you next month for our next 30-minute skills.